Welcome to another T.REX Talk. This is Isaac Botkin, and I'm super pleased to have a guest. This is the Honorable Representative Clay Doggett of the, I can never remember your district, 70th.
Yes.
70th Legislative District. And we would be happy to have you on anytime to talk all kinds of cool stuff. But this week, there's some specifically special to talk about. I am holding in my hand a very important letter. Actually, do you want to talk about the letter and introduce what it is? I mentioned it on Instagram. It hasn't been picked up by too many news outlets quite yet, but this is a letter that was sent to the governor yesterday, and there's one just like it sent to the Attorney General. Mm-hmm. And there are 43 signatures on this one, I believe. So why don't you tell us what this letter is asking the governor and the Attorney General to do?
Sure. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me
on
anytime.
Your
show. And I've got a good friend. I don't know if I should do this or not. Give him a shout out.
I think it's perfectly appropriate. I just have to ban a few FBI and ATF agents here in the chat while you give props out.
Okay, yeah. Dominic Genovese. Hope you enjoy. He's a good friend of mine, roommate from college. He's a follower of your channel, and so
he'll probably see this.
I hope he does.
Very good.
Dominic, thanks for watching.
Yeah.
But, so this letter that we have, there was a group of U.S. congressmen that I believe had sent a letter similar to their governor and attorney general of the state of North Carolina, I believe it was. And so we saw this and decided that, hey, this is something that needs to be done. Back, if you'll recall, several months ago, the current presidential administration had made some claims about they were going to do some federal gun firearms enforcement. They were going to really crack down on some things, and so
it was a good thing for them to prioritize, given everything else that was happening in the entire world.
Yeah, everything else that's going on in the world, they're going to go after firearms, and so in doing so, we in the General Assembly. We're in the middle of our legislative session. Now, last fall, back before the presidential election, I sat down with my assistant and a few other members and said, look, we're hoping that things will go a certain way with the election. We're hoping that President Trump will be back in, but just in case, we need a contingency plan, because I have a feeling the first thing that they're going to do is going to come after our firearms and come after our constitutional rights that we have. The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, and then the Tennessee State Constitution, which is one of the best constitutions, I believe, in our country, specifically states that we have rights to our firearms and they should not be infringed. And so we sit down and looked, and we came up with what we ended up calling the Firearms Confidential Protection Act in a roundabout ways. We never had an official title for it. But we worked really hard on that and got it through, and it passed this year. About the time that it was passing, the ATF was coming up with some rules that they were wanting to do. And the way, and this letter addresses two of those rules. One of those rules is 86 FR 27720, and it talks about the definition of frames or receivers and identification of firearms. And so one of those deals and is putting serial numbers on parts.
Oh yeah, we've talked about this one on previous TREX talks. Admittedly, the current way that they describe what is a firearm part, what is the part of the firearm that is the firearm, admittedly that is vague and problematic, but they are trying to solve that by making it far vaguer, far more problematic, and apply to all kinds of parts that have nothing to do with the function of the firearm. They all have to be serialized, they all have to be registered. Yeah, it's got a number of issues to it, and it doesn't even stop there.
No, and it goes further, and it essentially creates a registry of all firearms. And so, and from some of my studies and research, I found that in this registry, if you and I are friends, or if maybe I have a son. I have two sons and two daughters, and so if I wanted to gift a shotgun or a rifle to my son, there's got to be a record of that transaction, according to this. And so they would create a registry that, and if we do not report that transaction, then I could be charged with a felony. And so could my son, or so could you, if you were to gift something or to sell a firearm to someone that you work with. And so we worked hard on our bill that we carried, stated that the state of Tennessee would not have a registry. That they would not be a registry. And in doing so, we would not transmit any information that we already do collect to the federal government, or that government officer, agent, employee could be charged with a felony, an e-felony. And so, but this is what this letter addresses, the ATF, their changes that they're proposing to do. And so we want to make sure that our governor and our attorney general, what we're asking them to do is to not exhaust all means necessary to not infringe upon us any further than what's already been done so far.
Yeah. So and then the second reference to the proposed rule change, they have an additional rule change, which we've also talked about in past T.REX talks, which is the pistol brace, the stabilizing brace rules. So there's going to be a scoring system so that if pistol braces are on a pistol that falls into certain criteria as too heavy or has too many accessories on it, you can never actually put too many accessories onto a pistol.
No, I don't think so.
No, or a rifle.
Oh, right.
But then you get a certain number of points that turns it into a short-barreled rifle. That means that it has to be part of the NFA database, which means it has to be in a registry, and you have to pay $200 stamp and the whole 9 yards. So, oh, by the way, I realized that today is the last day. When the ATF proposes rule changes, they actually are required by law to invite comments on their proposed rule changes. The definition of frame and receiver proposed rule, that has been the comment collection period has been closed, but until the end of today, until midnight today, you can still submit comments on this factoring criteria for firearms with attached stabilizing braces. So I actually recommend that you go and you leave a comment, a clear, professional, kind, but uncompromising comment on why it is unconstitutional, wrong, impractical, or foolish for them to change and enact this proposed rule. Now, there's a bunch of people in the comments who are saying they won't read it or they won't listen to it. And I agree that they won't listen to it. But why do you think it's actually a good idea to submit that comment and actually have a public record of, we're not quite at 200,000 yet, but wouldn't it be nice if we could actually cross that $200,000 line and say 200,000 Americans, regular civilians, and quite a few elected officials and legislators were opposed to this proposed rule change, and you went ahead with it anyway.
Right. Well, I always would ask someone to go ahead and make that comment in the comment sections. One of the big things and another reason for this letter is this: in the state of Tennessee, and even with the federal government, the way law works, the way legislation becomes law, is it takes, in Washington, it takes the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate to pass a law together, and then it goes on the president's desk, and they have the opportunity to sign it or to veto or go through that process. In our state, just like every other state legislature in Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, Idaho, even California, Alaska, all state legislatures across our country have the same process. You bring a bill, you introduce a bill and that makes a change or creates a new law, and then they take that and it goes through the process where it's voted on if they have there's one state that just has one chamber, but we have two chambers in our state, so it'll go through the House, it goes through the Senate, and then on to the governor's desk. Once it becomes law, then if it affects a certain department, and they have to promulgate rules to enforce this. And so they go through the rulemaking process, and during that you have the public comment section where you'll come in and you talk about the proposed rule changes at the state level. The same thing at the federal level as well. And so by the ATF making these rule changes, there is no legislation in place.
Correct. They're creating new rules.
They're creating rules that it creates law and with penalties that you and I and thousands of viewers would all become criminals overnight.
Especially the stabilizing brace. I don't want to comment directly on how many pistol braces I own, but it's a lot. It's enough that I would be on the hook for, well, I think it's 10-year minimum sentence. 10-year minimum sentence if you have one.
Right.
And I think that they just stack linearly. So I would be in prison for a very long time if this went through and I didn't sign them all up with the NFA and spend, I don't know, however many other years it takes for all of that paperwork to come back and all those tax stamps. And they estimate in here that there's like 3 to 7 million of them out in the wild. It's at least 40 million. There's at least 40 million pistol braces in the wild, which is a lot. That's even more machine guns than we gave to the Taliban.
Oh, yeah.
So that's so it's quite a few. It's quite a few people that would be on the hook for potential felony charges. And I was just thinking about how many folks, because pistol braces are very common, and it is the only legal way that you can have less than a 16-inch barrel on an AR-15. That's an incredibly common thing. I'm just thinking about how many Tennesseans and Americans that went into a gun shop in the last 5 or 10 years, saw something on the wall that they liked the look of, bought it. They knew that it was legal because it was being sold at a reputable gun shop. They don't keep up with all of this stuff. They don't keep up with proposed rule changes. They don't know what's going on. Next thing you know, something happens and they have a 10-year minimum sentence felony that they had no idea that they were on the hook for. And it's actually kind of amazing, you know, what a massive change that this is, considering the sheer number of pistol braces that are floating around out there in people's homes. Sometimes in the homes of people who are heavily involved in what's going on and know what's coming, pay relatively close attention to what's going on. But the number of gun owners that have something that they bought because it was a cool range toy or because it was useful but don't keep up with paperwork, those guys are in significant danger at this point.
Sure, absolutely. And the scary part is for the guy that doesn't know, the guy or person that does not know that something like this is taking place, and if it was to go through and to stand, and they might have that AR pistol and drive down to the range and get stopped for speeding or something, you know, run a stop sign or have a tail light out or something that causes an interaction with a law enforcement officer. And then as they see, oh, well, hey, what's that in the back seat right there? What, in Tennessee, you're perfectly legal to carry your firearms with you in your vehicle. But, oh, well, that's a brace, that's a supporting brace right there. Oh, okay. So now that it gets into them, they make phone calls to maybe the FBI, who in return send them over to the ATF, and next thing you know, your traffic stop turns into a federal case, and you're in a federal court in front of a federal judge.
Yeah.
Because, well, one, you didn't know because it was perfectly legal, and there's no legislation out there that makes it illegal.
Yeah.
They're doing all this through a rule change.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant thing. I was just doing the math, so that's this adds potentially 400,000, or this adds potentially 400 million years of jail time to the American people, or we could pay the tax stamp, which is $8 billion in tax stamp that we would all have to pay to the ATF. So now their budget is quite large. Their budget is not quite $2 billion.
Sure.
But this would be a pretty significant boost for them. So the conflict of interest in this is also a interesting consideration.
And it could be an attempt to pay down our national debt.
Oh, it is true. I did see that Janet Yellen was commenting that the default was coming soon.
Right.
So that was an interesting observation on her part. Yeah, so it's a fascinating thing to see a law enforcement and regulatory agency making rules simply by, and this goes beyond rules, making law simply by creating new definitions for rules. And so I think it's entirely appropriate and necessary for legislators to push back and governors and the judiciary of states to push back and protect their citizens from federal encroachments, which are not just, it isn't just that this violates the Second Amendment, which it does. It isn't just that this takes away rights and threatens people for things that they already own and bought in good conscience and with clear legal commerce. But this actually violates very specific existing and current rules against what the ATF is going to do. They are prevented by very recent legislation from building or maintaining a registry, which is exactly what one of these rules does. And it's essentially what the other rule also does, only not for quite as many people.
Right.
But it's definitely a registry of potentially 40 million people. It's definitely a registry. So it is necessary for people to push back against this. You can go right now and you can comment on the pistol brace rule change, but I really appreciate legislators standing up and asking for governors and attorney generals and members of the judiciary and other law enforcement folks for interposing themselves between the federal enforcers and the rest of us to help protect us and to uphold our Constitution. So I want to thank you for that, for doing that. And I wanted to ask you, how hard was this to get done? Obviously, the gentlemen out in North Carolina, the reps and senators out in North Carolina that sent a letter to their governor, kind of got this ball rolling. But how hard was it for you to go around and get signatures from fellow reps and senators here?
Well, the good thing I can say is it wasn't that difficult.
Yeah.
Once they knew what we were doing, we had several that wanted to jump on board.
Yeah.
And I think that there would have been more on our letter had we waited and had a little bit more time, but we wanted to make sure that we got this out there as quick as we could because we knew that the public comments time was coming to an end very soon, and so we wanted to make sure that our governor and attorney general were aware of our position on this and asking for them to take a stand with us on this. But Tennessee's a great state. We've got some great men and women that serve in the General Assembly. We've got just overall just great people all across our state that feel the same way that we do. I represent roughly 70,000 people in my district, and 2/3 of our state has been deemed Second Amendment sanctuary counties.
Yes, yeah.
And so that's a big statement right there. And so, when this morning, when this letter hit media, I started getting some text messages and some phone calls from folks across the district that were very pleased to see that we were taking a stand. Many of them, I would say 99% of them that had called had no idea that this was going on. And so it was kind of flew in under the radar. Now this happened back, I believe it was either March or May when these rule changes were proposed. And so it kind of snuck in underneath, and we didn't really see it. So
there was a lot going on at that time.
There's been a lot going on, and any time that you want to get something done, you need a distraction over here so that you can.
I've counted like 8 or 9 distractions in the last real short amount of time.
Right.
So yeah. Well, part of the reason I asked that was, so North Carolina legislatures have sent a letter like this. Now Tennessee has sent a letter like this. Those of you in the comments right now who do not live in Tennessee, I see a bunch of Tennesseans in here. Call your local reps right now. Send them this letter. I'm going to link the text down below so that you can see that, and you can see the names of the folks who signed this letter. And I also want to say, I think you got some great folks here. The fact that not only did you get roughly a third of the General Assembly, but the fact that you got people who are the chairman on committees and subcommittees related specifically to criminal justice and civil justice and corrections, stuff that directly applies to this issue, I think helps. And House Majority Leader William Lambert signed it. So this is not just random backbenchers. These are the folks who are going to be called upon to enforce or help enforce these federal laws. These are the people who are going to actually be directly infringing upon Tennessee citizens' rights or be affected by these criminal charges. The fact that those guys were willing to sign this is really encouraging. The fact that these are the folks who are standing up is very encouraging. And hopefully that gives backbone to other folks. So my recommendation to you is contact your local reps in whatever state that you live in and send them this letter and say, hey, I would like you represent me, I would like you to send a letter like this also. This is your responsibility to stand up against federal encroachments. You are the lesser magistrate in between me and the federal government. Since the federal government doesn't listen to me, and there have been some national reps and senators in Congress that sent a letter to the ATF as well. So there are actually folks in the national level that are pushing back against the ATF. But I think it's really important that people fight back on every level. So I would say that it would be real important for you to go to your local reps and tell them, send a letter like this. It's really important that you protect us from federal encroachment. And you said it was relatively easy. So
Right. Well, it was for us, and
part of that is maybe Tennessee, but
maybe so. But at the same time, I always encourage folks to reach out to their elected officials and that's in Tennessee. Our state constitution states that the citizens, their duty is to tell their legislature how they are to perform, how they're to vote, how they're to carry about. And so I always encourage folks to do the same thing, no matter what state you live in, where you're at. And it even goes down not only to your state and federally elected officials, but down to your local, to your city aldermen or council members or county commissioners, or start from the top to the bottom, or the bottom to the top. You've got to let your voice be heard. You've got to tell these folks, because I can tell you right now, if no one ever calls me and instructs me on what to do, if I don't hear from them, I think that they agree with the position that I have. Now, I'm pretty hard on some of the positions that I take, and most of the calls that I get are hecklers, that want to, it might be 10 or 20 of them, but they don't represent the population that I represent. And so, but yes, always call, email, write. That's one of my biggest things. If I get a handwritten letter from someone, I really take the time to sit down and read that.
Yeah.
That's something nobody does anymore. Now, if you're going to write every member of Congress or every member of your state legislature, do it handwritten, you'd need to start now if you were going to get it out before January, because it would take a long time to write all those letters. But always contact your representatives and let them know what your thoughts are on things.
I think that is really important. And one of the reasons that I think that this is especially important, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but with what's happening at the federal level and agencies making this kind of legislation by fiat, legislation by mere declaration, it is more and more important that the lower levels of government and local governments actually be prepared to push back. And the first step of that is to stand up and comment on things. If you cannot get your local reps to even sign a letter saying that these rule changes are unconstitutional, that's generally a pretty bad sign. So I would say you should definitely be contacting folks and asking them to, at the very least, sign a letter like this. At the very least, ask their governors and their attorney generals to honor their oaths to uphold the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the states that they represent. I think that's really important. Now, there are comments in here which are commenting on the fact that the local governments are too small to do anything, and the big governments are completely lost, and so there's no hope for anything anymore, and that all law enforcement is redcoats now, which is something that I wanted to ask you about, because you are a little bit of a unique person. I don't think that I have met too many legislators. I can think of one other gentleman who is a state legislator who came out of law enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about your time as law enforcement, what you were doing, and some of your takeaways?
Sure.
I think it's very unique.
I did I did a lot of things when I was in law enforcement, but going in, you know, I was your basic patrolman, and so I had a lot of interactions with the public. Throughout my time in law enforcement, I started going to different schools and training to be certified, like what we called it, an SRT team, special response team. Some jurisdictions have SWAT, different things. Went to different schools, went through a sniper school, and did that. Went through entry schools, and so when there was barricaded subjects or some type of, you know, search warrants that needed to be performed or what have you, they would call us, and you go out in the middle of the night. And you know, you kick doors in or do different things, and so that's always been very interesting. A lot of things that I observed in my time in law enforcement, I brought to the legislature with me because I saw things that maybe needed fixed or could be done better to make sure that we're not violating the rights of folks. And a lot of it comes down to training and knowledge of what the Constitution says and what the law is. And so you want to make sure that your laws and your Constitution are always married together. And when you're in law enforcement, you take the same oath. I took the same oath as a sheriff's deputy as I did as a state legislator. The same oath that the governor takes and that our attorney general takes and the district attorney takes, you know, when they come in. And so, you know, it's to uphold the laws and the Constitution of our state and federal government. And so when you go in law enforcement, sometimes it's real easy to make mistakes, and you can do things without thinking maybe about constitutional implications that it might have. Maybe I use examples of traffic stops. You know, it's when you stop someone, you are seizing that person. You know, when you stop them, and so they're in your custody at that point. And so the way you move forward from that point, you have to be very, very careful and to make sure that you stay within the confines of the Constitution.
How, generally speaking, obviously can't speak for everyone, but generally speaking, as far as the newer laws and more modern training, how careful are people trying to be to stay within the limiting restraints that the Constitution places on them as law enforcement? How careful are people, generally speaking, to do what's right in that way?
I would say that it's a very, high percentage.
Okay.
In my personal opinion, when you go through trainings, that's one of the very first things that they talk about. It's not the techniques or the maneuvers that you go through. It's what you start with the Constitution and you work your way this way. And so you want to make sure that you're not violating someone's constitutional rights by what you're doing going in. Does this happen from time to time? Yes, it does, unfortunately. Is there a remedy or a mechanism in place to help for that citizen who's had their rights violated? Yes. You go through the court system. That's the way that our country was set up, and so you'll have those opportunities. It's unfortunate again that things like that happens, but for the most part, I would say everything has always been on the up and up that I've seen. And talking with law enforcement officers, I've been to training with folks from all over the country that we all have the same concerns. We talk the different things about, you come in contact with someone. Our state law may say that, you can't have a loaded firearm in your vehicle. Well, our state says that you can. Well, what about people walking around with handgun carry permits, or do you stop them and check them? Some states have true constitutional carry, where other states do not. And so how do you make your way through that and maneuver those hurdles to make sure that you're not infringing on someone's rights, because that is a very big deal.
Yeah.
When you violate someone's constitutional rights, there are major repercussions for that.
Now, how often do you think those major repercussions actually come down? let's look at the federal level, because I think there's a major difference between your county deputy and, say, an ATF agent. There are actually a number of ATF agents that run a website that anonymously, and some of them are ex-ATF agents who have put their names out there, but a number of them are current ATF agents anonymously asking for some level of accountability and oversight because there are abuses in multiple different areas. As you were a local guy and you were working in a community full of people that you knew, I imagine that that's a very different set of checks and balances than when you are a federal guy.
Sure.
And you probably interacted with federal guys.
I did. I had some interactions with them from time to time, various agencies. And they were, to be honest, I never had any bad things happen when I interacted with the feds. Everything was good. You know, we would initiate most of the work. Had done, you know, we might have started the case and then they come in and take the case over because it had
some sort of
had tentacles to it that went, you know, different places that they could use, and so they would take the case over, and then we end up getting subpoenaed into a federal court or somewhere like that. But I've never really had any bad experiences. Now, the one thing that you have when you stated about when people's rights are violated, or how the big point that I always look to is that civics is not taught, it's not learned anymore. Students are not reading and studying their Constitution. They're not even studying their state constitutions anymore. So if you don't know that your rights have been violated, how do you seek, you know, a remedy for that?
Yeah.
And so you've got to know. I mean, the duty is yours as a citizen to know that this officer or this agent or this agency has violated my constitutional rights. And so then you go through the process to get those restored. And it goes back, again, to folks just don't really, they don't know when their rights have been impeded upon.
Well, especially when it's done legally.
Right, sure.
Now, in this case, we have a really obvious, like, this is way out of bounds. This is outside of the scope of what the ATF is allowed to do, these two significant, massive rule changes. But you're in the legislature. Now, Tennessee has a predominantly conservative legislature, more so than a lot of other states. But there are other states, and there are federal laws that legally remove constitutional rights from folks.
Sure.
So, how can guys lower on the totem pole, like underneath the gigantic, you know, United States pyramid with federal at the top and then state at the bottom and then local a little below that, and then guys like me at the very bottom. What do we need to do to try to get back some of what we've lost, get back some of the knowledge of the Constitution and state constitutions in ways that we can actually push back against constitutional rights that have been whittled away or undermined or completely taken?
Sure. Well, number one is educate yourself. You know, go through it and study and read and even go back to the founding fathers, not only, you know, reading our federal Constitution, but read the writings that they had, the journals that they kept during that process when they were framing our Constitution, to see what their thoughts were. I like to look through the Federalist Papers. That's one of my favorite. I've got that sitting on my desk in Nashville, the Federalist Papers, and I've got highlighted and notes in there because periodically from time to time we'll have certain bills that will come through, and I've always been one that the Constitution is kind of, I really enjoy that, and making and defending the Constitution when it comes up, when certain bills that come through that might try to trample on it. And so, but educate yourselves, and then, you know, even down at the very local levels, you'll have cities that'll create ordinances that are not really constitutional.
We have a couple of those. I don't want to get into details, but in some ways it feels like that it's easier for that to happen because you'll have a town or city alderman's meeting, a few elected people, 3 people show up to see what they're voting on. Maybe it ends up in the local paper later after they voted on it. Like, some of that's really hard to keep track of.
It is. And so, when you find out when those local, when your city councilor is meeting or your county commission is meeting, try to go at least attend one meeting a year. I know that sounds like a very small number, but if you're working and have families and jobs or going to school, that there's a lot that's involved in your life, but make time at some point to go and attend these meetings, or at least stay in constant contact with your elected officials, just to see what's going on, what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, it is hard to keep track of all of this stuff. And I think you bring up a really good point. A lot of us, it's very popular amongst conservative circles to talk about this is what a right is, and it's like a bumper sticker. It's like there's no real substance to it. Or I think that I have a constitutional right to this, but there isn't really an understanding of what the Constitution actually says. When you became a legislator, what were some of the specific things that you wanted to accomplish because of your understanding of the Constitution? Did you have, I know that you had a number of particular areas of interest, but was there anything in real specific that you wanted to get done or to stop from happening that you saw happening?
Right. Well, the number one thing that I said was to end abortion. That I believe that all life, even a child inside the mother's womb, has constitutional rights. And so that was number one on my list. We passed some bills that helped get us to that, closer to that point. Texas just had a big win in their Supreme Court, or in the U.S. Supreme Court over one of their laws. But then the second thing that I did, and what I campaigned on, was to fight for and restore our Second Amendment rights. And I use the word restore because I felt like with our permitting system that we had in Tennessee, that was an infringement on our constitutional rights.
Completely agree.
Yeah. And so that was one of the things that I said right out the gate, that, and I was surprised at how many people really kind of pushed back at that.
That was another question I was going to ask, but I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole. But we have talked quite a bit about constitutional carry and permitless carry and some of the differences and where we actually want to go in Tennessee. And it's interesting to get pushback on what is real clear constitutional, like very clear constitutional principles. Not just stuff that's vague, but stuff that's extremely clear.
Well, I've had folks that are not even, not even in the legislature, that are, folks that I see every day at the gas stations or the grocery stores or what have you, and they'll say things like, I'm all about Second Amendment rights and constitutional carry. I believe we got a right to do that, but I think you ought to have some training first, before you carry a firearm around. Well, pistols are okay, but I don't want to see them on your hip. Put them in your pocket. Don't want to see anybody with rifles, walking around. That is not what our founding fathers, that mindset is not what they had in mind.
Well, and if you logically think through it, if you have a right to carry a firearm, but somebody can stop you from carrying it until you can demonstrate proficiency or a certain level of training, like what institution is that going to be, and how are they going to arbitrarily decide what a sufficient training is, and et cetera?
Well,
then there's no right at all.
Sure. In the past here, it was 8 hours in a classroom, and then you've got to hit a piece of paper at 15 yards.
But that was arbitrary also.
That was arbitrary, yeah. And so that doesn't demonstrate anything in my mind. Being taught from an early age on how to handle a firearm, I've got enough sense. But which then again, you've got folks out there that you've always got good folks and you've got bad folks, but everybody focuses on that few of the bad ones. And
that completely undermines the rights that you actually have from the Second Amendment.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I think a lot of people do miss is that Bill of Rights limits government. It doesn't limit us as citizens.
No.
It limits the government and says the government has no business deciding when you're allowed to buy a gun, or when you're allowed to carry a gun, or when you're allowed to carry a gun openly without a T-shirt on top of it. And so, yeah, we get a lot of those folks in the gun community who are very pro Second Amendment, but, and then
Right.
fill in the blank.
Sure.
And yeah, so how do you go about talking to people who are pro Second Amendment, but how do you address those buts?
That's tough. You know, when you sit down and talk with someone like that, you know, and most of the time it gets into this argument, you know, about, you know, what's right and what's wrong. You know, what is you know, you still have that right. You just have to have this permit, or you have to go through this training, or do, you know, that's their viewpoint. When, you know, you go back and you say, well, look, let's look at what the Constitution says. The real issue that we have is, it's not with the Constitution, but it's with the bureaucracies that we have created, you know, at the state and federal level, that come in like the ATF and they make rules. Even without, you know, you have the Constitution and we create law that coincides with the Constitution, and then they come in and they make rules to enforce this law, and that's when it gets all convoluted.
Yeah.
And so with our permitting system, that was a rule, pretty much. I mean, it was legislation, but the Department of Safety had to come in and make the rules
Exactly.
to go through that.
Bureaucrats came in and decided what safe and reasonable meant.
Yeah, and they're going to tell you, hey, this is what we need to see to make this work. You know, you need to get this training and do this, and this, and so I'm all about training. I'm very.
But you're not about legislating.
But not mandating training to be able to carry. No,
Yeah.
I encourage you to go through training. I encourage you to shoot. You know, when I was in law enforcement, we shot 50 rounds a year. That was
qualification.
Yeah, we had to qualify. That was state law, 50 rounds a year. So we'd shoot a box. We'd stand and shoot at a target, 50 rounds. And then your gun, in some departments maybe, and I've had conversations with law enforcement agencies across the country that say the same thing. You know, we go through now. Their departments may say every quarter we go out and train and do something. Being on the TAC team that I was a part of, I had the opportunity to shoot a lot more than other folks did, and so I gladly took those opportunities because I really enjoyed shooting. I enjoyed doing that. But you know, so
the training that law enforcement gets is pretty minimal in that area.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And to me, that would be, you know, should be up there at the top as to where your training is.
Yeah. Well, especially if you're going to say civilians aren't allowed to carry because they're dirty civilians, but policemen are allowed to carry because they're trained.
Right.
50 rounds of ammo, standing still, one spot per year. Yeah. Well, I've heard some pretty. So here at T.REX, we obviously talk about training and law enforcement quite a bit, and we've heard some horror stories. There are a lot of people who have shot their training ammo and then put their gun in its holster, and 3 months later they take it out and they forgot to load it, and nobody checked. And NYPD shoots a lot of bystanders because of one of their safety features that they have is a much heavier trigger than the stock trigger for safety. And then very minimal training. And then I think that somebody in the state level has crunched the numbers and said, paying settlement agreements is cheaper than training. So that's the kind of thing that you often run into with that. So where exactly do you want this letter to go? Like, this is obviously, let me read the last line of the letter. I recommend that you read the letter. We'll link to it in the video description down below. It says the ATF has tried to excuse their actions in referring to these rules these new rules that are essentially laws. I mean, they are laws because if you disobey these rules, you have committed a crime and you go to jail and you pay fines.
Right.
And you are a lawbreaker. So they are.
They're writing law, and they can't do that.
It says here, they've tried to excuse their actions by complaining that the current rules make their job difficult. The letter from the House of Representatives, this was the National House of Representatives, reminded them if difficulty for law enforcement in enforcing the laws was the test as to whether agencies have carte blanche to ignore basic fundamental freedoms, then the Bill of Rights would be rendered meaningless overnight. Because, that Bill of Rights gets in the way when you want your government to be bigger and more powerful. No doubt the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement makes it more difficult for law enforcement to intercept drug shipments, yet the inconveniences posed by the Bill of Rights of the ATF are not negotiable. The congressmen go on to state it is not the place of the agency to manufacture crimes out of thin air to trap the unsuspecting and otherwise law-abiding citizen. And then your letter says, this creation of law by agency regulation sets a dangerous and unlawful precedent. We trust that you will stand with us and millions of your constituents against this injustice. Respectfully, we request that you refuse to enforce such arbitrary and illegal rulings and that you activate the legal means and law enforcement powers of this state as necessary to prevent the ATF from providing for its own enforcement of such criminal measures within the state of Tennessee. And then the 43 signatures of representatives and senators. So what do you think that actually looks like for the governor and the attorney general? It's pretty easy to tell Tennessee law enforcement, hey, you're not allowed to ask to see people's tax stamps. You're not allowed to check for suppressors. You're not allowed to double check with tape measures and things, all the different things that the NFA talks about for shoulder braces. Stabilizing braces, not shoulder braces. That's if they can touch your shoulder, it's like 10 points right there. I think.
Right.
Yeah. So what do you think this activating the legal means and law enforcement powers of the state to prevent the ATF from providing its own enforcement? What exactly does that look like, do you think?
Well, it really starts with because the governor is the head of like our Department of Safety that we have in the state and the Homeland Security that we have here, and so by addressing this, if this does come to fruition, and if the ATF, if the federal government decides that they are going to really push this and go after the citizens of this state, then we're relying on the governor to say, our local law enforcement agencies, we're not going to help. Number one, because the ATF doesn't have the manpower that in our state that all federal agencies that I've seen. There's thousands of them that work in those departments, but when it comes down to it, you normally have one or two agents that are relying upon your local sheriff's departments or police departments or your highway patrol to aid in their investigations or in the case that they're working. And so we eliminate those resources to them. Now, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it on your own. Secondly, our state attorney general is going to file suit in court, in federal court, to put a stay on this, to stop it, to challenge the legality of what they're doing. And so once it goes before a judge, the judge can then say, well, this is not even a law. This is, you can't do this.
Yeah.
That happens in the state all the time when they come up with these rule changes for various. There's a fly after me.
Yeah, I'm afraid that the guys who were in New Mexico brought back some bugs.
Oh man,
it was a pretty. Apparently, there were a lot of bugs.
Well, I thought it might be me. I don't know if I stink or not, but I did take a shower today. But anyways, yeah, it's agencies they promulgate their rules every year and how to effectively enforce the laws that we've had that have passed, and so. And that happens. They bring up rules that end up getting overturned from time to time. Fortunately for us in our state, there's a committee, a government operations committee, that every time that these rules come through, they have to be presented to a committee of legislators. And so those legislators have to sign off on those rules. Whereas when you go through the federal government, there's still a process to go, but this is very dangerous, what they're doing.
Yes.
And so in asking our governor and our attorney general to stand with us and to fight back and push, I'm very confident that they will.
Good. Well, and I recommend, again, to viewers that you look at the text of this letter and you send it to your representatives in your own states and demand the same thing of your governors, your judiciary, and get your legislators to help you with this, because it is a very hard thing to push back against the federal government by yourself as a lone individual.
Sure.
And this is something like you mentioned, how dependent federal law enforcement is on local law enforcement. It really requires local law enforcement to have a spine to stand up and say, well, no, we swore to uphold the Constitution. What's most important is that we actually protect our citizenry from you guys who are doing unconstitutional things than from one another in this case. And I can think of a lot of cases. There are a number of departments that do that, just really dependent upon local law enforcement to show up. And I've heard of several cases where Child Protective Services will take a police officer to a home, and then the police officer is just there to be intimidating. He doesn't actually know
Don't even
the
know what's going on.
circumstances. Yeah.
Right.
And the homeowner, the parent, will say, well, you need a warrant to come in here. And the police officer will say, yeah, that's true, you do need a warrant. Then the Child Protective Service officer will say, well, no, in this case we don't. And then the police officer has to do the right thing.
Right. Then you've got to make a determination. And I've been on a couple of those before.
Yeah.
I don't like it.
Yeah.
I don't like how bureaucracy weaponizes your local law enforcement agencies in that manner.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they do, because you don't know. You're just told you need to escort them to do their visit. You don't know if it's already been prearranged. And when you get there and you find out that
you're there to be the muscle for something that they weren't even allowed to do in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I've been in some arguments before, and I was told, you're not going to go back with them anymore. Because, somebody's got to take up for folks, and getting into child protective services, that's a whole nother
Yeah, I didn't really
debate.
want to open that can of worms, but there are a couple of particular bureaucratic agencies that tend to lean more heavily on law enforcement than others, and tend to provide less information to law enforcement than others.
Sure.
And the ATF is one of those, for sure.
Well, it's a need-to-know basis.
Yeah.
You need to know that you need to be here at this
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
And,
So how much did your experience interacting with those folks affect? You mentioned a couple of specific things you wanted to do in the legislature. How much do you think that affected your desire to go in and provide some more local protections? How much did that drive you to become a representative and to have more of a say on good laws and stopping bad laws?
Right. Well, it really what started for me was a tax, a fuel tax that come through, that I just thought was really unfair. Especially in our state, we had $2 billion surplus that we could have used to fix roads or do whatever. And so when I see surplus, I think of, well, that's my money, that's your money, that's everybody's money, that the state has overly collected.
It's not often the state admits that they've taken too much money, but in this case they did.
Sure, they do. And we have a surplus every year. And so that's one of the things I fought for, is to try to find ways to get that money back to the citizens of this state. The budgeting process is another thing that's an animal all to its own, how the state budgets. Can't even talk about what the federal budget. I mean, they're just making, I guess, print money and using monopoly money,
true.
something. I really don't know what it is that they're doing, but
They don't really know either.
I don't think they know either. They need to get it under control, but and that takes change. And just like in our state legislature, if it takes change. And so that was one of the big driving factors for me. And once I started looking around, that what else, because I was kind of like most folks. I was in the dark, You know, I'd studied government in college and had been in law enforcement and was up to date on the Constitution and had studied through it and was very well versed in all the criminal laws that I would have at my disposal, you know, or would experience. And so when you start looking at everything else and you say, hey, wow, you know, there are some things that could be made better. You know, these are some things that are essentially limiting our rights when it should be the other way around. You know, and so thankfully there was a lot of like-minded folks in the legislature that I get to serve with that want to fight the good fight too.
Yes, yeah, and I have to say I was very impressed. So this letter. Now, you know, I know a lot of folks on the Hill, and have had good conversations with a bunch of folks, and have also got into, I don't know, some of those conversations about permitless carry versus constitutional carry, a little more friction. I actually thought that this last line of this letter that said, you're asking that our governor activate the legal means and law enforcement powers to prevent the ATF from enforcing these criminal measures. I actually thought that might be a bridge too far for a little bit too many people like that. Well, last line would have been just a hair too strong, but they would sign on for less. I was actually really encouraged at how many folks and you know, who specifically signed this letter, that they're willing to stand up that much and ask the governor to go that far.
Sure.
So,
and I was impressed as well. And you may recall we passed 2 bills last year. One that I referenced earlier with the that we would not create a registry in our state with the purposes of keeping up with serial numbers and how many guns you have and everything else. Brian Terry, a good friend, representative from over in the Murfreesboro area, had what he called FIPA, which was a federal Firearms Information Privacy and Protection Act. And so the state, you know, both of our bills just kind of coincided together. So if this rule was to go through, and if the ATF was to come into Tennessee and say and start telling folks, you know, your FFL folks, that you've got to keep records of all your sales and transactions, because right now, unless I am incorrect on this, if I purchase a firearm today, they do a background check, and then all that information is gone. And so I walk out with a rifle or a handgun or what have you, and all that information is gone. It's not kept, it's not stored.
Just the paperwork at the FFL gets put in a box, but all the background check information is supposed to be scrubbed.
It's all scrubbed, all that information. Now they need the serial number for the background check. They need all that information, but all that it's all scrubbed. And so with this, there would be even more paperwork, and then they're going to keep all the information on the background checks.
Yeah. So that is the frustrating part. Is it seems like people are in that federal level paying attention to some of the restrictions that the local guys are placing against data collection and storage, and they're trying to get around it by some of this legislation specifically. I think this is actually aimed at some of the measures that local guys have put in. So
sure,
it's coming to, I feel like it's coming to a head here. And I think it's important that people be ready for that. So I want to thank you so much for coming all the way out here and talking. And I really appreciate your putting all of this stuff together, getting all these people on board with this letter, and asking the governor to do the right thing here. And I do think that it's worth going to that ATF page. I tried to actually bring it up and it wasn't working right now. It's kind of shocking that the ATF or any other government website or anything related to the government might not be functioning all the time, but their website wasn't working right at the exact moment that I checked it. But I'll put a link into the description. Go and comment on their new rules relating to stabilizing braces, because that's gonna criminalize an estimated 40 million Americans if they enact it. Not to mention the illegal databases that it would create. Not to mention the other problems. problems.
Oh yeah.
There's so many problems surrounding all this.
We have a lot more problems going on in the world right now than stabilizing braces and,
Yes.
and frame and receiver definitions. So I do want to thank two people that really helped me out a lot with this, and that's Noel Knorr and David Tucker, whom you know both of those.
I actually do.
Pretty
I do
well.
indeed.
But great friends, and they really helped out a whole lot with this, and so very thankful for them.
Yeah, I really appreciate their work, and I really appreciate you guys taking this letter and sending it to your own reps, and starting to put some checks and balances back in place where they haven't been in the past, and asking people to just have a backbone, actually know what's going on, be informed of what's going on, and actually do something about it. So thank you very much for watching this episode. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate this letter. I haven't seen it in the news nearly as much as I had hoped. The Tennessee Star ran it, and a few other conservative papers have picked it up, but the Tennessean and national folks who would normally be talking about this stuff are notably silent. So,
well, I mean, that's to be expected, really. Crickets from around the country, but yeah, and that's not that was not our intent, was to grab headlines or anything like that. I know sometimes lawmakers will put out things in an attempt to grab the headlines. Or what we're after is to grab the attention of our governor and attorney general and say, stand with us, protect us, help us, fight with us.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next week with another. I'm not sure what it's going to be. I'm guessing it's going to be about airsoft. I'm guessing that Lucas is going to have some very interesting observations from the airsoft thing down in New Mexico, working with and training with a whole bunch of interesting folks. I've already heard a couple stories from that. It sounded like it was pretty interesting. And we'll see you then. Thank you so much.